I love that song, and I love that we've seen it in community, because when I examine the altar, it is a place of reconciliation, and it's a meeting place. It's a place where the divine reaches down into our lives and reaches up and says, I am present with you in your humanness. It's a place to meet God and to see his face. So as we go into a time of corporate prayer before the sermon today, I'm not here to give a focus for our prayer today. I simply want to open the altars for the next 5 or so minutes as a place for us and in our own lives and in our own struggles. That much as Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, that his last act as a free man was to go pray. That Jesus, in his last act before experiencing excruciating pain and suffering and abandonment, he said, I must go meet at the altar with God. That I must reach up as my Father reaches down. That in Jesus' last acts as a free man, he spent them at the altar. So for the next 5 or so minutes, before we proceed further, I just want to encourage us in a time of prayer together as a community, that as we ready ourselves for this week, as we ready ourselves as a community, that we learn to make it a practice to meet at the altar, to reach up as our Father reaches down. The altars are going to be open for the next 5 or so minutes, and then we'll proceed with the service. Good morning. Good morning, guys. So I just want to extend a warm welcome to if we have any visitors in the room. I just want to say hi, and I'm so glad you're here. I am not the pastor here of B1 Naz, as you've heard earlier. He never actually tells me what he's doing. He just tells me he'll be gone and tells me to drive up from Missouri. So it's always such a blessing to be here. But for any of you who aren't familiar with me, my name is Levi Moberg. I grew up in this church here. My parents are back there. Hi, Mom and Dad. And I'm now college educated, so that's something. But I currently call Springfield, Missouri my home, but it's always such a blessing anytime that Pastor Jeff needs someone to fill the pulpit, that he feels comfortable enough to call me and to ask if I'd be interested, which the answer is always yes. It's a true blessing and honor to get to fill the pulpit at the place where I found Jesus, at the place where I learned to love the Christian community. So we're going to get started today, and I need to warn you all, you're my guinea pigs today, because we're going to do something a little bit different. So as I finished my undergraduate degree at Evangel University, and I've begun to start working on my master's program at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary, I've taken a couple preaching classes. So some of you were here when Jeff had asked me to preach well before I'd taken any of those, and you remember how rough it's been. So hopefully I learned a couple things. But as I've considered the model in which we interpret Scripture and the model that the church propagates, the way in which as a community we learn, there's some very certain set rules to how we do this. So if you have any experience with the American evangelical commitment, and you were to walk into almost every church in America this Sunday morning, here you will find the same product. And I'm going to call it a product because they use the same model. You will see a gentleman or a lady walk up to the platform, and they will stand behind a pulpit or a podium or a music stand of some kind. They will introduce themselves to the guests as I've done. They may provide a little bit of information about them if they are speaking, if they suspect they have guests in the audience or someone who wouldn't be familiar with them. They will then provide a personal story, an icebreaker, something to relate to their audience. It may be funny, it may be tragic, but the reality is that the story is real. It's something from their own lives in which they use to impart. The second thing they will do is they will open their Bible, and they will begin to read a passage of scriptures, anywhere from 5 to 15 verses. They will then begin to proceed in a mechanical event that in the academics we call exegeting a passage, which is a fancy way of saying they're going to tell you a little bit about what the passage means in its original context. If they're in the Old Testament, they'll throw around words like ancient Near Eastern and in the cultural context of the time. If it's in the New Testament, They'll start using words like Greco-Roman and patron and servant. And if they're trained in biblical languages, they may throw out a word like politueste or chesed in an attempt to sound smart, as I've just done. And then they will have walked you through the passage as they've done in their weeks of study leading to this. And you will walk away with a feeling, a better idea of what that passage has meant. But the other thing that they will do, and where my considerations have come to be, is what they will do is they will give you 3 points. That these 3-point sermons is the ultimate truth for your week. That is how to live your Christian experience in the coming week. And they are very practical, and they probably all start with the same letter for the alliteration. But the reality is and I love these types of sermons. They are so important, and I'm in no way attempting to provide or speak against anyone doing those. In fact, myself, I'll be preaching in 2 weeks at another church in Missouri, and I've already started looking, and I have a 3-point sermon, and they all have the same letter. So I had to make sure I got the alliteration there. So I'm certainly not asking that we go away from this, but my consideration is that the way that the text has been approached and the way that it has been taught to congregations for the better part of the last 100 years in North America is that we've been given the text as something that you can put through a mechanical process and always receive 3 same-lettered applications. And what I have found that it causes to do in talking with my peers and in my examination of my own life is that when we separate the Bible and we have come to associate that these 5 to 15 verses must always mean this, that this is always the true experience of the Christian life when we read this, that mechanically every preacher will agree on this, even if they use different language. The problem is we begin to lose the narrative. And again, I am no way trying to diss on 3-point sermons or this type of preaching because it's important. But when I examine the Bible and when it was written, and I begin to examine how the first audience would have experienced it, it was orally. And it was all at one time because they didn't have the chapters and verse divisions. Those were later added as study references, right? You know, it's harder to say, hey, remember that one time in the Psalms when it kind of says, hey, praise be to God? Yeah, it was every other line. So verse and chapter divisions are very helpful, but it wasn't how they experienced it. And when the Corinthian church opened Paul's letters, they read them in community, and they read start to finish. And there's so much that we can't unpack. It's impossible to preach a single book in a day. But what I'm trying to propose to you today is that we must learn to be a part of the narrative of the Bible. Because so often we feel that, I am a white man from Iowa who lives in Missouri. I have very little to do with the ancient Near East or the Greco-Romans. But by my adoption into Christ, their narrative and their story is mine. So I have 2 things that I have. One thing I'm going to do today. It's a little bit odd, and I'm going to ask that you stay with me, and that's why we're calling this an experiment. That's why you're my guinea pigs. So today, what I've done today is I've written a historical fiction. It's brief, and I would like to read it, about a man who is sharing the book of Matthew with his children. And I've decided to not skip the genealogy. And the other reason I've decided to focus on Matthew 1 in this narrative is because often when we are discipling people, often when we decide that it's time for us to learn the narrative, to learn our heritage, we start in Matthew 1. Because you say, start in the New Testament because the Old Testament's weird. And that's a whole nother conversation for another time. But there's the Genesis 6 wall. You hit Genesis 1, and it's this beautiful creation story. And 2 and 3 provide the somberness and the sadness and the tragedy of the loss of Eden. And then you have this beautiful story of Noah. And then we get to Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, and there's too much to do with that. And if you're a new Christian, that's immediately going to turn you away. But Matthew 1, I would say the New Testament has an earlier barrier, and it's Matthew 1. You don't even get past the first couple verses because we have, and he was the father of, and he was the father of, and he was the father of. And what I want to propose to you today, other than finding ourselves in this narrative, is I want to propose that the genealogies here are not just a table of contents, nor are they something to ignore. Rather, the genealogies that's found in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke are rather reaching to this audience and saying, here is the narrative, here is your heritage. This is part 2. This continues it. So I'm going to pray, and I'm just going to ask that you allow me to do something a little unconventional this morning. Lord, thank you